Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holachak, historian, philosopher, and Thomas Jefferson scholar. I'd like to talk about the recent shift of opinion by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and their evidence for it. In their report from the 1998 DNA evidence, which is presumed to implicate Jefferson in the paternity of Sally Hemings' child, Eston Hemings, the Thomas Jefferson, was called the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, concluded that there was a high probability that Thomas Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings, and that it was very likely, or most likely in their own words, that he was the father of all 5 other siblings of Eston Hemings. That in itself was a conclusion that was not warranted by the evidence, as we'll see pretty soon. But on June 16, 2018, they formally had a sea change. They went from high probability to asserting flatly and factually that Jefferson was the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children. What one would presume that there was some startlingly new evidence that forced this change. There wasn't. That's what's astonishing here. There is no new evidence. It seems that somehow they have gained a clarity of vision that hitherto they did not possess. I want to show, by going over the evidence, that there's something fishy going on here. Okay, let's look at the 10 scraps of evidence in their manifesto published on the webpage of the Thomas Jefferson, published on Thomas Jefferson's webpage. They say, first, and in their own words, Madison Hemings provided an account of his mother's life that was published in an Ohio newspaper in 1873, many years after Jefferson's death. The basic outline of Madison Hemings' account, including his mother's treaty with Jefferson in Paris, and the freedom granted to him and his siblings, was well known to his community before it was published. His narrative is the most important extant evidence, and much of the corroborating evidence supports the outline of the narrative. Madison Hemings' account is massively flawed, right, because it's based on oral history, and oral history has its own problems. He's speaking of events to which he was, for the most part, he was not privy, to which he was not privy. He wasn't there. He's hearing stories in the oral tradition and saying that these things must be true. So the problems with oral history is when things get passed down, they get contaminated. Moreover, the Pike County Republican, the paper in which he published, had perhaps a political agenda. The editor of the journal the newspaper had, and there's evidence to suggest that the newspaper wasn't doing so well at the time, was very likely a strong anti-Jefferson person, and he would have had strong motivation to publish an essay that incriminated Jefferson here. There are as well a number of testimonies in favor of Jefferson's integrity, of his honesty. Overseer Edmund Bacon, whose character cannot be called into question, who was there at Monticello for much of went on, he saw just about everything, stated this. He stated that one of Hemings' daughters was not Jefferson. I quote him. She was not his daughter, she was blank's daughter. That's a clear statement by someone who was there every day, that at least one of Sally Hemings' daughters, one of Sally Hemings' children, was not Jefferson's. Okay, and that is inconsistent with Madison Hemings' testimony claims that Jefferson fathered all 6. So why ought we to disregard Bacon's testimony, which is the testimony of someone who was there at Monticello, for someone who's basing an account on oral history? Ought we to dismiss Bacon's account because Bacon was white? That seems untoward, and it's not just. I can refer, for people who want to do more, refer to Robert Turner's excellent review in the Scholars Commission on page 105 and following. Second, their claim. Foster and his colleagues in the 1998 DNA study revealed that male line descendants of Eston Hemings, a son of Sally Hemings, and male line descendants of Field, Jefferson's father, who was Thomas Jefferson's grandfather, shared the same Y chromosome haplotype. That demonstrates that Eston's father was a Jefferson male. This result not only corroborates Madison's account in the Pike County Republican, it definitively refutes the claims by Jefferson's grandchildren, including Ellen Randolph Coolidge and her brother Thomas Jefferson Randolph that either Peter or Samuel Carr, they could not agree on which one was the father of Sally Hemings' children. Now, if there are no flaws in the methodology of Foster in the DNA study, we concede that Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings. That doesn't implicate Thomas Jefferson because anybody in the male Jefferson bloodline would be a possible candidate. Now, the argument is that Jefferson, since he lived there, is the most probable candidate. I don't even know that that's true. I think the most likely candidate is Jefferson's brother, Randolph Jefferson. And Randolph, we know, frequently visited Monticello and would frequently enjoy the company of Thomas's slaves. Slave Isaac Jefferson says the following: "Old master's brother, Massa Randolph, was a mighty simple man, used to come out among black people, play the fiddle and dance half the night, hadn't much more sense than Isaac." Moreover, Peter or Samuel Carr might have fathered children with Sally Hemings. We don't know that he didn't. Sally, like her mother, might have been sexually promiscuous. We cannot rule out that possibility. Her mother was, and people in the Thomas Jefferson Foundation certainly just assumed one paramour, and they assumed that it had to be Thomas Jefferson. So we can build the case for Jefferson's paternity by many, many assumptions made, and these assumptions are not warranted. Third, they write, Madison Hemings was described by a U.S. census taker as the son of Thomas Jefferson in 1870. To what do I say to that? Next. Fourth, Israel Gillette Jefferson, formerly enslaved at Monticello, corroborated Madison Hemings' claim in the same newspaper, referring to Sally Hemings as Thomas Jefferson's concubine. All right, Jefferson's own grandson offers a refutation of Israel's bogus claims. Isaac claimed to be a waiter at Monticello and Thomas Jefferson's personal assistant by the time of Jefferson's second term as president in 1805. He claimed to recall distinctly Thomas Jefferson's departure from Monticello for Washington. Israel was born on March 3, 1800. How could he have, so all these claims certainly had to be false. Israel and his family, says Thomas Jefferson Randolph, that's Jefferson's grandson, was on the list of slaves leased to the farm of a certain Mr. Craven at the time of Jefferson's presidency. Fifth, they argue, Eston Hemings changed his racial identity to white and his surname to Jefferson after moving from Ohio to Wisconsin in 1852. Newspaper accounts in Chillicothe, Ohio in 1887 and 1902, Thomas Jefferson. Critique. Spreading the story that he was the son of Jefferson, if that is the reason for the change of name, would have been for Eston a golden ticket of sorts, would it not? What of the resemblance? Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, acknowledges the similarity of appearance between Thomas Jefferson and some of Hemings' children. He writes, she, Sally, had children which resembled Mr. Jefferson so closely that it was plain that they had his blood in their veins. One child, again I quote, at some distance or in the dusk and dressed in the same way might have been mistaken for Mr. Jefferson, end of quote. Now, the resemblance is explicable by Jefferson being their father, or by Randolph, or another Jefferson being their father. Okay, the qualifiers at some distance and in the dusk intimate that there were distinct facial dissimilarities and that the similarities between the children, the male children, and Thomas Jefferson were of the most general sort. Sixth, they write, the two oldest surviving children of Sally Hemings, Beverly Hemings and Harriet Hemings, were both allowed to leave Monticello without pursuit and were described as runaway in Jefferson's inventory of enslaved families. In an 1858 letter to her husband, Joseph Coolidge, Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Wales Randolph Coolidge, while denying Jefferson's paternity, described Sally Hemings' children as all fair and all set at my grandfather's death, or had been suffered to absent themselves permanently before he died. Commentary. The Hemings slaves were awarded to Jefferson with his marriage to Martha Wales Skelton from her father, John Wales. All were given significant or light duties in and around Monticello. All were privileged in Jefferson's household. All were sufficiently light-skinned to pass as white in white society. All were sufficiently skilled to survive in white society. Seventh, Jefferson's records of his travels and the birthdays of Sally Hemings' children revealed that he was present at Monticello during the estimated times of conception for all 6 of Hemings' documented offspring. Statistical modeling shows the likelihood of coincidence for any other male, if we assume that Thomas Jefferson is not the father, as 1% or 1 chance in 100, strong evidence of Thomas Jefferson's paternity. Okay, these coincidences claimed cannot be precisely corroborated. Even if Jefferson was at Monticello some 9 months prior to the birth of each of Sally Hemings' children, do we know whether Sally Hemings was present? That is more likely than not, I'll concede. That we can only surmise, and surmise is not good enough for us to claim as fact that Thomas Jefferson was the father of all Sally Hemings' children. Was Brother Randolph present? For a more elaborate discussion of the dating, see Bob Turner's Scholar Commission Report, pages 125 to 134, where he discusses these coincidences. I could say with respect to the statistical modeling, I've written on that in my book, Framing a Legend, disclosing the distorted history of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, that the Monte Carlo method with Bayesian induction involved is horribly misleading because the data plugged into the Bayesian formula is contaminated. It's data that's strongly suggestive of a relationship, and once plugged into the formula, of course you're going to get a strong statistical argument, right? It ignores other data, the possibility of Randolph Jefferson being there each time or any time or anybody else with the Jefferson Y chromosome. It ignores the data concerning Sally Hemings' whereabouts. So you plug in contaminated data and you get the outcome. Strangely, by the way, in the report here they say there's a 1 in 100 chance of Jefferson not. And if you read Fraser Neiman's sort of devious report, you get a 1 in 1,000 chance of Jefferson. So they don't even get the report correct. Okay. 8th, oral tradition connecting the Hemings and Jefferson families was transmitted among the descendants of both Madison Hemings and Eston Hemings over many generations. Madison Hemings calls Jefferson his father in his 1873 recollections in Pike County Republican, a fact repeated by his descendants. Eston Hemings' descendants altered their family history to state that they were related to one of Thomas Jefferson's relatives in order to hide Eston Hemings' decision to change his racial identity when he moved to Wisconsin. Okay, commentary. First, there are the problems with oral tradition and whether this is persuasive. Oral tradition, obviously, this stuff doesn't get, it doesn't get admitted in a court of law, so why should we take it so seriously? Moreover, the strongest oral tradition was in the Thomas Woodson line, another slave who claimed to be an offspring of Jefferson. The DNA testing done, in the Woodson line proved that Woodson was not related to Jefferson. Second, descendants of Madison Hemings should repeat a story that Madison gave in the Pike County Republican is unsurprising. If Madison claims that he was the son of Jefferson in that report, why should we expect to find his offspring disagreeing? Last, Julia Westerinen, a descendant of Sally Hemings, asserts that the oral tradition was that she was a descendant of Jefferson's uncle. It was Fawn Brodie that told her she was related to Jefferson. I have already spoken to the oral tradition. 9th, Jefferson freed all 4 surviving Hemings children in accordance with the terms of his negotiation with Sally Hemings, as reported by her son Madison in France. He did not grant freedom to any other enslaved nuclear family. First, in commentary, there's no proof of any negotiations between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson while in France. It's all in Madison Hemings' report, which we have reason to cast into doubt. Now, the Hemings as a whole were close to Jefferson and his family. They were afforded, as I said, special important duties and light duties because they were a gift from Martha's father when Thomas Jefferson and Martha were married. Sally Hemings' mother, Betty, was half white and may have been the mistress of Wales, but that's part of the oral tradition, says Madison, without confirmation. We can't know. All the offspring, all of Sally Hemings' children, were lightly colored and of sufficient skills to enable them to pass for whites and to integrate into white society so they could readily be freed. It is noteworthy that Sally Hemings was never freed. Now, all of the children were freed at some time. Not all were freed precisely at the time of Thomas Jefferson's death. A brother of Sally Hemings was, one of the males in the Sally Hemings line. No, there's a brother of Sally Hemings was freed early in the 1800s and committed suicide. 10th, the names of Sally Hemings' 4 surviving children, they say William Beverly Hemings, Harriet Hemings, James Madison Hemings, and Thomas Eston Hemings suggest family ties to Thomas Jefferson. Annette Gordon Reed outlines these naming connections in her book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, 1997. A man named William Beverly accompanied Jefferson's father on an expedition through Virginia in 1746, and he was connected to Jefferson's mother's family by blood and marriage. There were multiple Harriets in the Randolph family, including a sister and a niece of Thomas Mann Randolph, Jefferson's son-in-law. Madison Hemings was named at the request of Dolly Madison, whose husband, James Madison, was one of Jefferson's closest friends. Historian and biographer Fawn Brodie offered 2 possible explanations for Eston Hemings' name. Eston was the birthplace of Jefferson's maternal ancestor, William Randolph, in Yorkshire, England. Thomas Eston Randolph was also the first cousin of Jefferson. Jefferson described their 2 families as almost being one. Furthermore, it was convention for Jefferson to be involved in the naming of family members. His children with Martha Jefferson were given the names of his sisters and mothers, and he personally named each of the grandchildren. What do we say to that? There's an awful lot here, but notice the language in which it's couched. They say, the names of the slaves, Sally Hemings' children, suggest, it's not a very strong argument, that something X suggests something else Y is uninformative. X implies Y, or X is the cause of Y, in contrast, is not. We don't have that here. So again, moreover, the story that Dolly Madison insisted that Madison Hemings be given the name Madison is very likely to be false. We have good reason to think that she was with her husband in Washington at the time of Madison Hemings' birth. Okay, what do we conclude? This is the mountain of evidence that they've given us. It's the same evidence that they had at their disposal in 2000, nothing new, and yet now we have it fact. None of these arguments is compelling, so why can we call it a fact that Jefferson's the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings' children? Each argument taken by itself shows nothing, but imagine they might concede that. They might say, okay, but if we put all the arguments together, we have certainty, right? Isn't that sensible? No, it's not. Consider, for example, the 10 coincidences that are readily accessible on the lives of Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln. What are we to make of those? For instance, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln made by a Ford. The word Kennedy has 7 letters, so too does the word Lincoln. Spooky, right? And so on. None of these really moves anyone, but I guess the argument is if you take them together, well, there's no more of a coincidence. There must be some sort of spiritual relationship between the two. Perhaps Kennedy was the incarnation of Lincoln at some point. Well, that's spurious as well. The real conclusion is if you take any two random persons, compare the facts concerning their lives, you're certain to find numerous, not just 10 moving similarities, none of which shows anything. Now, those similarities are meaningless when one considers the indescribably large number of facts that pertain to each person over the course of a day. Now, consider the facts related to a person over the course of a lifetime. They are so unbelievably numerous that it would be astonishing if you couldn't find thousands of strange coincidences linking any two random people. So QED, that shows nothing. I argue it's the same with the 10 scraps of evidence which amount to 10 unconvincing arguments proffered by the Foundation. We can't group together 10 arguments, each of which shows little, and get one large argument that inescapably indicts Thomas Jefferson. If that were the case, then the more insubstantial arguments we should amass, the tighter would be the case for Jefferson's paternity. Yet anti-paternity adherents could do just the same, and then we'd have an airtight argument that shows Jefferson is the father of all of Sally Hemings' children, as well as an airtight argument that shows Jefferson is not the father of all of Sally Hemings' children, and logically speaking, that just can't be the case. In logic, adding together many weak arguments does not give you a strong argument. The fact that the Thomas Jefferson Foundation is amassing evidence invites large caution. I say that because, whenever anyone is throwing out a barrage of arguments for some claim, they're doing so because they don't have a Sockdolager. They don't have a compelling, knockdown, convincing argument for a claim. I say that because if I have one strong argument for something, one compelling argument, there's no reason for me to throw in other arguments. That decides the issue. There's no reason to throw in. So the strategy employed by the foundation, amassing evidence in the form of many arguments for some conclusion, this goes back to antiquity. Plato employs it in Crito when when they're trying to convince Socrates to escape from prison and so not to die. Crito throws out numerous arguments in machine gun-like fashion, and Socrates says, I'm not interested in any of these. The only convincing argument is that in escaping from prison that I shall be doing harm. I shall be doing wrong, not good. If you can convince me that escaping is a good thing, fine, but he's not convinced. Now, also we see it in the oratory of Demosthenes, the Greek orator, and Cicero. It's called swamping. The idea is to throw out a superabundancy of arguments, none of which by itself is compelling, and sort of overwhelm an adversary and force someone to accept the claim as true because I've just heard so many arguments, I'm sort of tired, and that's that, I accept. But that's rhetoric, and that's why Socrates was put to death. Socrates refused to do that. Socrates refused to live a rhetorical lifestyle. He was always interested in truth, and because of that, he was put to death, or so Plato and others say. Now, there's nothing in the manifesto of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation that shows Jefferson is the father of Eston or of any other Hemings children. There's nothing that shows that it's even likely that he was the father of Eston or of any of Hemings' other children. How then can the Thomas Jefferson Foundation claim he's the father of all of children? That's the question, isn't it? Still, the foundation declares, remove the qualifiers. It is no longer a question of likelihood. It's a matter of fact. They decree, and I quote from them. As the Thomas Jefferson Foundation began planning the life of Sally Hemings, an exhibit that relies on the account left by her son, Madison Hemings, which we've shown is incredible, it became apparent that it was time to re-examine how to characterize Jefferson's paternity. For nearly 20 years, the most complete summary of evidence has remained the report authored by the Foundation in 2000. While there are some who disagree, the Foundation's scholarly advisors and the larger community of academic historians who specialize in early American history have concurred for many years that the evidence is sufficiently strong to state that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with Sally Hemings. End quote. Again, we saw that Madison Hemings' testimony in the Pike County Republican was flawed. They're relying massively on the truth to the neglect of other firsthand reports of Thomas Jefferson's character, which, if anything, do more to vindicate than to indict him in paternity of Sally Hemings' children. They also conveniently exclude the report amassed by Dr. Robert Turner of University of Virginia by the Scholars Commission, in which a large group of scholars examined the exact same evidence that Thomas Jefferson's Foundation scholars examined and came up with a radically different conclusion. All but one scholar conceded that Jefferson was very likely not the father of any of Sally Hemings' children. So one of the strategies here, obviously, is to ignore evidence to the contrary, and that's just wrong in history. All evidence has to be. So if the Thomas Jefferson Foundation right now wants to declare that Jefferson is the father, it is incumbent upon them to examine evidence to the contrary and refute it. Their strategy, ignore evidence to the contrary. In logic, and I have been trained in logic, that's called cherry picking. That's called having your conclusion before you look at the evidence and then examining only or looking at only evidence that's consistent with it or that in some degree supports it. That's not good enough. That we can't have that. All right, so they conclude, in the new exhibit exploring the life of Sally Hemings, her choices and her connection to Thomas Jefferson, as well as in updates to our related online materials and print publications, the Foundation will henceforth assert that the evidence indicates and eliminate qualifying language related to paternity to Eston Hemings, as well as that related to Sally Hemings' 3 other surviving children whose descendants were not part of the 1998 DNA study, right? We're stating as fact now that Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings, even though the DNA evidence doesn't give us that. We're also stating that the 5 other children, without there having been any DNA testing to eliminate the possibility of promiscuity on Sally Hemings' part, which is a distinct possibility simply ruled out by the Foundation by decree. This is an ex cathedra decree. It seems to me that members of the Foundation have assumed papal infallibility. That's not good enough, right? This issue has to remain open. We as a people must demand that there be open, critical debate, that other sides of the issue be heard. Right now, they are suffocating. They have made the move. This is a political posture with seismic consequences. They have made the move that other voices now need not be heard with insubstantial evidence for their conclusion. That's a very dangerous position to take. That is totalitarianism. We're going to decide what books can be read, what information can be leaked to the public. We as a public must demand change. We must demand that there be debate, and it be open debate at Monticello. I myself would love to come down and debate Annette Gordon Reed or other paternity adherents. Why is that not possible? Why does not Dr. Robert Turner come down and debate? Why is Annette Gordon Reed and other adherents like Peter Onuf have historically never allowed any sort of debate, and they're shunning debate? We must demand debate on this issue. And I promise you, if there is debate, the general public will be convinced that we just don't know whether Thomas Jefferson was the father. And that is an important claim. We're not trying to implicate or trying to free Jefferson from paternity. He may be the father of all 6 children. I don't really know, but at this point in the game, we don't know. And as a public, we have to demand better. So let's demand open debate on this issue. And let's also demand that there be some house cleaning at the Foundation, that the president of the Foundation be removed, and other people who have an investment in the Sally Hemings story be removed as well, such as Fraser Neiman, who's the archaeologist. Thank you very much.